Hello and welcome back to another notes video. This will be the third notes of Unit 5. You have previously done notes on photosynthesis and ATP. At the end of our ATP notes, we mentioned that ATP is made by the mitochondria in a process called cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is the focus of this notes video. So, cellular respiration is a chemical reaction that turns sugar, or chemical energy, into ATP, which is energy. This happens in the mitochondria. Think back to our Unit 2 about cells and to our last note video about ATP. What type of organisms have a mitochondria? If you answered animals, that's correct. But animals aren't the only organism to have a mitochondria. Plants and animals have a mitochondria, which means plants and animals do respiration. Respiration is the process of making usable energy. And since energy is a characteristic of life, all living things need to be able to make and use energy. So, how is ATP made? What is cellular respiration? The mitochondria takes in sugar, or glucose, and breaks it down in order to release ATP. So, how do plants and animals get glucose? Glucose is a form of sugar that's made through the process of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis takes in sunlight and uses it to make sugar. That sugar can then be broken down by either plants or animals in the mitochondria to make it into ATP. Plants have that extra step before respiration. Animals do not have a chloroplast, therefore they cannot make their own sugar. How do animals get sugar? Well, we eat it. We either eat plants or other animals in order to get the sugar we need to make energy. So, these two processes are often drawn as a cycle because they rely on each other. Take a look at this cycle. Where are the products of photosynthesis? Remember that products are things that are released by that reaction or produced by that reaction. It's what comes out. Looking at those arrows, the arrow out of photosynthesis is sugar and oxygen. Glucose and oxygen are the products of photosynthesis. ATP, adenosine triphosphate, has 3 phosphate groups. When you break off a phosphate group, energy is released. When you add a phosphate group back on, the battery is recharged and ready for use again. That's often why I say ATP is energy, ADP is a dead battery. When that phosphate group is removed and it becomes adenosine diphosphate, it's a dead battery because there's no charge in it. So the energy that we're talking about is stored in those chemical bonds. Last class, I compared this to like breaking a pixie stick. When you break a pixie stick, sugar comes out, it's released. When you break a bond in ATP, energy comes out, and energy comes out, it is released. So respiration is the process of taking sugar and breaking it down in order to release ATP, energy. Take a look at this equation. Where would you find the reactants for respiration? On the left or on the right? As a reminder, reactants are like ingredients. They're the things that go into a reaction. It's what you start with. And what you start with in this equation is sugar and oxygen. Think about this in terms of animals. We breathe in oxygen and we eat sugar. What are the products of respiration? You're going to find those on the right side of the equation. So the products of respiration are carbon dioxide, which I often call dirty gas, right? Water, and energy. How you might see this in an animal is when you breathe out onto a pane of glass, you might see it becomes very foggy. What you're breathing out is carbon dioxide, dirty air, and it also has a little bit of water in it. That's what makes the glass foggy. So there are two types of respiration. There's aerobic and there's anaerobic. Aerobic sounds like air because it is when oxygen is present. Aerobic makes more energy. Think about if you're running. Which one is going to keep you going longer? When you're able to breathe or if you're holding your breath? You're going to have more energy in the presence of oxygen. That's aerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration is the opposite. There's no oxygen. And because there's no oxygen, it makes very little energy. In fact, it only makes 2 ATP when comparing it to aerobic, which makes 36 ATP. So, let's postulate. If you are running a marathon and it takes about 4 to 5 hours for you to run this marathon, what type of respiration is your body going to be doing at the end of that marathon? Think about our pulse lab we did at the beginning of the year. If you're jogging after a long period of time, what does your body start to do? You're going to start to sweat, but you're also going to start breathing really heavily. That's because your body is running out of oxygen. So towards the end of that marathon, if there's no oxygen present, you're going to be doing anaerobic exercise because there's no more oxygen. One of the products of anaerobic exercise, where you don't have oxygen, is that your muscles get sore. This is through a process that makes lactic acid. So if you're exercising or lifting weights or running a marathon and you're running out of oxygen, your muscles will start to make lactic acid, and that acid is what makes you sore. Fermentation is also a process that's done in other things, like when we do yeast or bread in order to make yogurts and alcohol. This is when respiration happens in the absence of oxygen, and it's able to make other products like alcohol. So let's review. Respiration is the process of taking sugar and making it into ATP. There's two forms of respiration: anaerobic, where there's no exercise, there's no oxygen, and aerobic, where there is oxygen. Aerobic produces a lot of energy. In fact, it produces 36 molecules of ATP. Anaerobic, since there's no oxygen, only produces 2 molecules of ATP. There are two types of anaerobic respiration: lactic acid fermentation, which is when your muscles get sore, and also alcohol fermentation, which is when yeast eats sugars and turns it into alcohol. So, if you were exercising, which one's going to keep you going longer? If you said aerobic, you would be correct. Aerobic, because it produces more energy in the presence of oxygen, is going to have you exercising longer. So, the presence of oxygen affects the amount of energy available to an organism. But let's look at why that might be in this equation. Remember what we talked about in photosynthesis equation? There's something called limiting factors. Limiting factors means you need to have enough ingredients to make the product. I can't go into making a cake unless I have all the eggs I need, or I'm not going to be able to bake my cake. The same is true if I have extra ingredients. For example, if I have extra eggs and sugar and flour and butter, I can make extra cakes. If we look here, oxygen is a reactant. If I have extra oxygen, I can make extra energy. More in equals more out. So think about this like when you're eating. If I have a very small breakfast, if I'm only eating a granola bar for breakfast, I'm probably not going to have a very large afternoon poop. But if I have a lot to eat for breakfast, if I have pancakes and waffles and eggs and sausage and bacon and hash browns, I'm going to probably have a very large afternoon poop. Because the more I put into my body, the more comes out of my body. The same is true of an equation. The more I put in, the more I get out. The more oxygen in, the more energy out. That's it for our notes today.